Hi, my name is Andrea. I am a licensed associate professional counselor here at Cumberland Counseling. I am bilingual, and today I'll be talking about demystifying the couch in the Latino community.
Hi, I am Selena Noble. I am also a licensed associate professional counselor and a master's level social worker, and I will be talking about demystifying the couch in the African American community today.
Hi, I'm Janet Hodges, and I'm a licensed professional counselor. And today we'll be talking about religious aspects of culture and demystifying the couch in the church. So today we're going to talk about therapy in a cultural context. Culture encompasses the behaviors and the beliefs of a person and informs how identity is formed and maintained. It becomes a framework for how a person sees themselves and relates in relationship to others and in the world in which they exist. Cultural factors may include, but aren't limited to, race, ethnicity, religion, attitudes, values, sexuality, social structure, etc. We even talk about workplace culture. Most cultures have beliefs around the process of therapy. Today, we'd like to take the opportunity to explore the impact of racial, ethnic, and religious culture and provide space for exploration and discussion to allow for acculturation or individual openness, perhaps adjustments to new cultural views of therapy. So let's get started and talk a little bit about ethnic views.
So like I said, I'll be talking about demystifying the couch for the Latino community. And just a little heads up, this is generalized knowledge, research that I've done, what I've seen working with the Latino population and being a Latina myself and growing up in a Latino household and what I've seen. So Latinos come to therapy about 50% less than white Americans. And this is largely due to lack of access and lack of education of what therapy actually is. So when we talk about lack of access, we're talking about the cost of therapy. We understand that the cost of therapy is pretty high, and there's a lot of variables for that reasoning behind that. But we work with clients here at Cumberland Counseling, and we have a sliding scale. We don't ever turn anyone away due to finances. So a sliding scale means that we can go as low as what works for you and your family, depending on your income. Another thing that people don't know about is you can use your HSA benefits from your employer. And also, if you're paying a monthly premium with your insurance provider, they often cover the cost of therapy as well. We do not cover insurance. We do not work with insurance companies. And again, there's a lot of variables for that.
Yeah, sometimes it can be difficult working with insurance companies because they have a lot of restrictions that we may or may not want to adhere to in terms of what's going to be your best treatment. And so for right now, we're not working with insurance companies. You may have an opportunity to send a super bill or something like that to get some of those costs paid by your insurance company, and we'd be glad to work with you in that.
And lastly, research shows that the therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist is the most important as it relates to outcomes in therapy. So finding a therapist that you really connect with, that understands your culture, who's culturally sensitive, is really important for the Latino community. I know that in the past, or I've heard many times where Latinos may drop therapy because they don't feel like they can bring their full self to therapy. Finding a therapist in the community that is Hispanic can be very hard. So I want to encourage you that I'm here at Cumberland, but also finding a Spanish-speaking therapist can be really hard. Again, I'm Spanish-speaking. And if you ever are looking for someone outside of that, there are people who are culturally humble and who celebrate your culture. And so we really strive to be non-judgmental. We are trained to be culturally sensitive. We're trained to be have cultural humility. So if you're having a hard time finding a Latina therapist in your area, please don't let that be a barrier. And I always encourage doing a 15-minute consultation with a therapist just to ask them, what is your experience working with this community? What do you know about working with this community? things like that, because I know for the Hispanic community, we are very family oriented and very tight knit and interdependent. And so if someone's coming in as a therapist and maybe talking to you about being more independent, and that's kind of coming against your frame of mind, then that can be tough. So just a little encouragement there. So one thing that we see is a lack of education, and this is where a lot of the stigma comes in. So common misconceptions that we see is if you go to therapy, you're crazy or you're severely mentally ill, and that's just not true. According to the CDC, mental illness is common, and 1 in 5 U.S. adults are living with a mental illness, as well as 1 in 5 adolescents. And the reality is we live in a broken world, and that there's suffering, and we can be going through a life transition. We can have just lost someone. There's trauma that sometimes we don't even know is at play. So the reality is that there are a lot of different factors that can cause a mental illness. If I'm diagnosed, I am bad, I am wrong, I am flawed. And this is kind of what happens when we don't start talking to someone about it, is that when these thoughts kind of get left in the dark and we don't bring it to anyone and bring light into that space, a lot of times we can start thinking we're the issue, when in reality you may just be living with mental illness, and having a therapist kind of put the puzzle pieces together for you and help you kind of uncover and unpack what's been going on can be really helpful, and can help you kind of have compassion for yourself and understand that, again, life is hard and things happen. So just like we have illnesses in our body, we can have a mental illness as well. And so we go to the doctor, we see a physician to let them know, hey, this is going on. Same thing when we go to see a therapist. We're just letting them know, hey, I'm struggling with my mental health. I'm struggling with my emotional health. And we're here to help you. Another common misconception is if you go to therapy, you're weak. So honestly, I have felt like the clients that I see are the most courageous people. They are motivated to solve problems. You're assertive, you're being open, and you are believing in change. And so what happens when we don't go to therapy is actually can cause more issues down the line. So what we see sometimes is the cycle of avoidance actually causes whatever is going on to grow. So whatever we avoid actually grows. And I'm going to have this little handout here for you guys to see kind of what happens as we allow mental illness to kind of sit. And therapy is hard work. We don't downplay that. Therapy is really hard work, and processing grief, processing trauma can be tough. But that's why it's so important to have a therapist that understands and can gently walk you through that process. Something I always tell my clients is the only way out is sometimes through. And that's tough, but we're here to walk you through that. And that doesn't mean you have to sit in that. That means that on the other side is healing. On the other side, you're going to find a better future for yourself, a better future for your partner, and you're going to be doing it for your future family as well. And a lot of times I also say, like, you're breaking generational patterns and curses that we often see in the family lines as it relates to mental illness. So if I talk about issues in my family, I'm betraying them. And there's kind of like this saying in the Hispanic community saying, La ropa sucia se lava en casa, which means dirty laundry is washed at home. And this phrase refers to kind of any problems that you're going through, keeping it confined to the privacy of your home. But the reality is we're not talking about things at home, and then we're not talking about things outside of the home. And so again, we're in this cycle of keeping it to ourselves. And what we see is if you continue to kind of keep these things to yourself, again, what we don't expose, what we don't talk about continues to grow. And that's where in my practice, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I've seen unprocessed grief kind of turn into like panic attacks because people are holding on to so much.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if either of you will talk about somatization and how emotions kind of get stuck in the body and how that can look like when people go see their primary care physician. They might say, I have a really bad headache, or I have a really bad stomach ache, or I have I'm having trouble breathing sometimes, or things like that. And that's, again, a primary care physician might tell you, hey, this kind of sounds more like mental illness as they run an evaluation on you and things like that. So just something to be.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
It sounded more beautiful when you said it, and it sounded more tolerable when you said dirty laundry is washed at home. Because in the Black community, there's a saying that says, what happens in my house stays in my house. It's a lot more aggressive. But that's just interesting that you guys, to see that, like, that's similarity.
Right. It's like, are we communicating or something? That's interesting.
But just like that, and if you look at, because I don't talk about this later, but it just made me think about that. Like when you look at like the health disparities in the Black community as well, it's like, yes, we are suffering so much more in our health because we're carrying so much trauma and stress.
Yes, absolutely.
But we acknowledge that, but we don't acknowledge the mental piece. So thank you for sharing.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, I agree. In the church, it's the same way, right? Like we don't want, like we clean ourselves up and we put our best clothes on and we go to church on Sunday and we leave that stuff in the car. We leave it at home, right? And we don't want to talk about it. And it's easier to ask someone to pray for a physical ailment than it is to pray for a mental health ailment.
Wow.
And yet they're linked and they go together.
Yeah.
So like, to me, like so important that we're all talking about it in all different cultural contexts.
Absolutely. So to kind of go back to that, if I talk about issues in my family, I'm betraying them. The reality is we keep confidentiality. What is said in therapy stays in therapy. It stays with us. And so we will not also be dishonoring your family members as we explore some of these issues. We will keep an unbiased opinion and walk you through what it looks like to work on whatever you're bringing in with your family. We don't tell you what to do. We just provide a space for support. And another thing is we can bring in your family members as well to therapy. I do that a lot with my Latino clients, whether it's daughter and mother or son and mother or whoever it may be that wants to come to therapy and work through some conflict for 1 or 2 sessions. And then we just go back to the individual. So that's something that we can always do as well. And then lastly, I just want to talk about lack of knowledge about what symptoms actually look like for depression and anxiety. Because I've asked clients before, like, okay, this sounds like depression. And they maybe like, I don't know, what does depression look like? And so walking through some of these symptoms can be helpful so people can just gain understanding of what that may look like. So with depression, we'll see like feelings of sadness, hopelessness, angry outbursts, irritability, loss of interest and pleasure in doing things that you used to love doing, sleep disturbances, tiredness, lack of energy, reduced appetite, weight loss, anxiety, agitation, and restlessness, slowed thinking or body movements, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, fixation on past failures and self-blame, trouble thinking, concentrating, and making decisions, thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, unexplained physical problems such as back pain and headaches, kind of like the somatization piece. And then for anxiety, it may look like feelings of nervousness, restlessness, tenseness, having a sense of impending danger, panic or doom, having an increased heart rate, breathing rapidly, sweating, trembling, feeling weak or tired, trouble concentrating or thinking about anything other than the present worry, having trouble sleeping, having any kind of GI issues, having difficulty controlling worry, having the urge to avoid things that trigger anxiety.
So why demystify talking about, the couch? And as Andrea did such a wonderful detailed job. She's made a difficult topic, like this overarching topic of counseling or therapy, that can be seemingly difficult to understand, just to make it a little bit clearer, a little more easier to understand. And I thank you for doing such a great job of doing that. For my portion, I just kind of want to focus generally on the Black community and demystifying therapy in that way. And first of all, to make it very clear that therapy is for anyone who could be struggling with anything in life. And it's not just for a special group of people. And this is very important to emphasize, I think, for Black people, because we have literally been taught like therapy is for white people. This is not what we do. And therapy is for people who are crazy. And so when you've heard those messages, whether they're implicit or explicit growing up, it's not something that is of a regular conversation in your household or in your community. And as a matter of fact, we kind of coined the word therapy, but we use it in other contexts, like going to the gym. That's my therapy. Going to the hair salon. That's a huge thing. That's my therapy. Going, to pamper yourself. That's my therapy. And so although those things can be very helpful in coping with struggles in life, therapy is a little bit different, to where you are actually working on treatment goals, you're working on objectives, you're able to measure your progress and to see where you're going and growing in life. And so like you were saying earlier, like therapy can be hard and at the same time, it's very rewarding.
Yeah.
Okay. And so just thinking about my purpose of just even sitting here today and my own journey of like therapy and me not even learning what it was until I was like maybe in my mid-20s, just really learning about mental health and how it, is important for me. Being a member of the Black community, someone who has gone to therapy, who's decided to go back to school, to become a therapist. And as a Black therapist, I currently see my own Black therapist because that's still very, very important for me. And so when I think about therapy for the Black community, I think about it being for any and everyone because we have all dealt with generational trauma. None of us are exempt, unfortunately.
Could you explain what is developmental trauma?
Generational trauma?
Yes.
Just trauma that I would say has like a residual effect, right? Like something my parents may have gone through, it affects me. Something my grandparents have gone through, it affects my parents. And just kind of going back in the generations and being able to say like a lot of, I will say, the millennials that I see now in my practice, some of them will tell me, I just want to understand like why I do what I do, because some of it doesn't make sense to them. And a lot of times it's because of generational trauma. Like we do things that we feel like are very traditional or are very Black culture without the understanding and reasoning behind them a lot of times.
Yeah,
And
research actually even shows that genetically that's coded in our DNA and is passed generationally in our DNA.
Yeah. It's called epigenetics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. And that brings up the whole, to simplify it, like the nature versus nurture argument, right? It's like, I just came from a family reunion. I didn't grow up with my father's side of the family. I grew up with my mom and my stepdad. And to go back home as an adult and to see my father's side of the family and to be like, okay, I do that too. Or okay, like,
where did that come from?
It's like, okay, I think like that too. Just to have a connection of like where I come from. But I didn't grow up around them. But there's still like some mannerisms, some ways of thinking, some things that we do that are very similar because somehow epigenetically it's been passed down throughout the generations. And that's more of a lighter, example. But the next slide I wanted to share with you all is kind of like the heavy truth of what Black people in America have had to experience that has really impacted the generational trauma. And so I want to read this post for you guys. And it was posted literally about a month ago in July from Malcolm Jamal Warner. And I don't know if you guys remember who he is, but he was Theo on The Cosby Show. And so he has some really, really insightful things to say all the time. And so one of the posts he said, and just to give you some context, this was about a month ago when the media had a lot of coverage going on about affirmative action. And he wrote, after 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years of housing discrimination, which is also still present, let's not act like the playing field has ever been equal. Folks are mad at affirmative action, but not at the conditions that made it necessary in the first place. And so, yeah, when I saw that, it stopped me in my tracks. It kind of it was just like, whoa, like that's really heavy to stop and read and sit and think about, you know, as someone who is in the Black community. Because when you think about it, what comes up for me is like if you physically, in a simple form, write all this timeline down, it's like we haven't had a lot of time of freedom. Like this is a timeline of oppression in a society that we live in day to day, based on the specific factor that you are Black in America. And so this is the generational trauma that we have had to grow up in. And even though I'm not in slavery, I'm not in Jim Crow, I'm not in separate but equal, the residual effects of all of that still plays out today. What I tell people to make it simple, as my mother was born in the 50s. And at that time, we didn't have the civil rights movement until the 60s. So my mother was born while there was still segregation. That impacted me. And it's not uncommon in the Black community for children to be raised by their grandparents as well. And so if you're being raised by a grandparent who spent a lot more time, you know, in segregation, that's going to impact you in some kind of way. So the question is, how does that impact your mental health, right? And when I think about the conditions that Black people had to live through in America, I can imagine wanting to emotionally disassociate, right? And so when you do that, you're not really connected to your emotions. You're not really feeling, because you are in survival mode. You are trying to figure out your basic necessities in life sometimes. And you are trying to figure out how to survive in a world that treats you in a cruel way. And so you're not functional. You're not mentally healthy. You're not emotionally mature. And if you're unable to be able to feel those things because of what's going on around you, how are you able to communicate those things to your children? And so when I think about being in practice, a lot of times, pretty much all the time, I end up going back into my client's past or back into my client's upbringing. And they learn how to connect the dots of why they do the things that they do. But for Black culture, that's really counterintuitive to how we've been taught, because we get taught to move past things. You don't sit in there. You don't cry. You don't wallow. You don't let them see you sweat. You just move through, you press through, and you move on, because life is not going to stop for you. And so if we're not allowed to feel, if we're not allowed to acknowledge, how can we understand really what's truly going on inside of us? As I read that and as I talk about that, I want to invite you to just sit and think about what comes up for you. What do you remember from your past? What do you think is impacting you now?
I feel like for both the Hispanic and Black communities, like we're constantly in survival mode, and like we're constantly just trying to make ends meet sometimes. And so you're never in that calm state, like of the window of tolerance. You're either like somewhere in the dysregulated area or and so that's like your nervous system is constantly activated. And what does that do? The cortisol that's constantly running through your body. And then just
and again,
mental
the physical
implications.
effects of that, which we're much more likely to notice the physical effects without really necessarily attaching them to the mental health effects.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I want you guys to sit with that, and I'm going to put a feelings wheel up so you can identify, what you're feeling right now as we talk about the things, okay? So when we're thinking about bringing you into the therapy room, I want you guys to understand that it's a place where you don't have to be strong, but you're able to be vulnerable. It's a place where you don't have to minimize your emotions or minimize what you're going through. And it's also a place where you don't have to be self-sacrificing. It's a place for you to be able to let all of that go and to be able to process through whatever it is that you feel like you need to move forward in your own healing. And I like to think about it as being a place where our community can collectively work on themselves at the individual level. Because just as we have generational trauma, we can also have generational healing. And it will impact us generationally if we are all doing the same type of work on ourselves. And my next to last slide, this is just a kind of impromptu thing. It's a couple of quotes from people. And I specifically wanted to ask the Black men in my life their opinions. And I asked them a question. And I said, why do you believe Black people should go to therapy? And so these were just some of the answers that I got. And I was just like happy all in my heart and my soul because it is really challenging. I will say, and I don't know what you guys have seen, but just to get men on the couch and just, to get them to connect with their feelings and their emotions. And I've seen like the evolution, even in my own life, just by being a walking example and just by talking more about mental health and just by giving them this non-judgmental and empathetic space as a friend or as a sister or as a cousin, that they've kind of come around a little bit more. And it makes my little heart happy. Awesome. But one of the quotes, it says, we need therapy because in Black families, we don't talk about the trauma we go through. It gets swept under the rug. We don't want to embarrass our families. It's necessary to talk about the traumas we go through so it won't weigh on our minds. Another one said, I think all people need therapy, but to answer your question, I think we as Black people have generational hurts that are passed down subconsciously. The way we are taught showed us how to work around rather than to how to deal with issues at hand. We were taught to just pray about it, and therapy was for crazy people. And the last one says that there's an expectation for men to not be emotional. So society can bring down Black men, and they need a space to be able to know how to deal with that. And so I just thought that was really beautiful for them to A, have a buy-in about therapy, and B, just really have a solid opinion of why we all need to go or why it would be beneficial. And lastly, just to leave you with this quote, you can't heal what you refuse to confront. And although it's very hard to sit with the reality of what history has been for us, it is very necessary. And once we get to that place, we can start to unpack and uncover all the layers that the generations before us were unable to do. And we'll be able to teach that to our children, who will take that even farther and teach that to their children. And it will become a ripple effect in the other direction. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about demystifying the couch and the pew. So how Christian culture may affect how we view ourselves. So I'm going to look at religious cultural views of therapy, primarily from a Christian perspective. I recognize that these are generalized statements, and I don't presume to speak for all religions or all Christians. This is both my own cultural experience and the experiences that clients have shared with me. I think that it's safe to say that the field of psychology and the modern Christian church have not always seen eye to eye. Right? If we look back to the emergence of psychotherapy and good old Sigmund Freud that we may have learned about in school, we see roots in his atheistic beliefs, including beliefs that neurotic manifestations emerged from religious faith and practice or oppression in the church. Right? The church, as a result, took what appears to be quite the opposite approach and encouraged that all healing should come from an increased engagement in spiritual disciplines. Right? So in a simplistic way, evangelicals believed that they were defending their faith by considering that the emotionally disturbed had sinned in some unknown way. They considered sin to be the root cause of all mental health manifestations. Right? So like we know in modern day that that's not like true, right? Like there are physical things that happen as a result of stress, right? And it affects our mental health. That all issues that we encounter do not come from sin. They more likely come from living in a fallen world and trying to cope with different aspects in the fallen world, including multitudes of different types of trauma, both within families and within the environment that we live in. So during the 1960s, right, even as all cultural norms were being challenged, so also the church began to explore how aspects of psychology might be acculturated into the church, right? So how we could begin to blend the truth of the church and the truth of scripture with what we were experiencing in real life, right? From here, we begin to see the emergence and of different emphasis as Christians join the ranks of helpers, as psychology began to appear back with Sigmund Freud and others, young in some of those early, right? Like the church didn't feel like they could have a part other than through pastoral influence. During the 1960s, there became a new emergence of different helpers from Christian places in order to deal with the needs that people were expressing. So I'd like to talk about what some of those different helpers are, because I think that's part of the mystery that we find around who do I go to, right, when I'm experiencing what may or may not be a spiritual problem, right? So there are pastoral counselors, and pastoral counselors in large part provide services rooted in a specific theoretical or theological point of view, right? They typically hold degrees in theology. Some of them now, often newer pastoral counselors, also hold degrees in psychology. We have Christian counselors, right? And Christian counselors, according to the International Association of Christian Counselors, seek to carefully discover those areas where a Christian might be disobedient to the principles and commands of scriptures and help them learn how to align themselves with God using the Bible as a lens, right? So you'll find that people who identify themselves as Christian counselors first or biblical counselors are going to defer to scripture as their lens and are more likely to lean towards that place of discovering where there may be sin in your life that caused a mental health issue. Social workers and licensed professional counselors, a little bit different, are trained to holistically integrate faith into their practice. They believe that faith in a faith community can be a form of resilience, protection, leading to a greater sense of well-being, and is socioculturally determinant of health. So Christians who operate under licenses for either social work or professional counseling are trained to integrate their faith and into the work that they do. Okay, so therapists at Cumberland Counseling Centers are trained social workers, licensed professional counselors, and marriage and family counselors, and are prepared to support all of our clients in exploring all aspects of culture, including their spiritual cultural roots. We're willing to engage in all aspects of therapy, helping clients engage in treatment of the body, mind, and soul using evidence-based practices, regardless of what their religious affiliation is. There are many issues that people are struggling with, often things that are considered taboo or shameful in the church. Things like divorce, abortion, infidelity, pornography, sexual orientation, sexual abuse, family violence, sexual promiscuity, addiction, trauma in its many forms, and you name it, those things that you probably really are hesitant to talk about, would not be caught talking about in the church lobby, right? But maybe need to talk about in context of how it affects your spirit, how it also may be affecting your body, and how it may be affecting your mind. So that therapy can be a safe space to explore all of these topics and more, absent of judgment or standard Christian responses, to provide you with an opportunity to make choices that are congruent with your identity and within your cultural context. So we invite you to come to therapy to explore those things that maybe you have felt but have been hesitant to say out loud in a safe space, right, where you're not going to find judgment, and that you're going to be able to explore how that may integrate with yourself as a spiritual person. At Cumberland, we address faith from a holistic perspective. So if you have a faith that you want to integrate into the work that you're doing, we welcome you to do that. If you don't have a faith, we are not going to try to convert you. That's not our job. We're here to help you process how faith and spirit work together for you. We don't come from a single denomination. We don't adhere to the same, but we will allow you to express and to explore different ways that you may express your faith, or ways that your faith is not working for you.
I think one thing that we are trying to make clear is that we are not afraid to stand in who we are. We are Christians who love Jesus, and this is our ministry and our calling and our purpose. However, if you don't, flow that way, if you don't identify that way, we still welcome you, and we want you to come. And ethically, we will do everything that we can to make sure that you are taken care of in this space. And so we don't turn anybody away. So we want you guys to feel comfortable and safe here. And thank you for considering us at Cumberland.